So my goal for this talk is, of course, to talk about the project, but also to hopefully fill in some of the gaps from bioassessment when the streams are actually dry. So we're all really familiar at this point what some of the perennial biota is that we use for bioassessment. Again, we did go away from fish in California, but we definitely do use the macroinvertebrates and algae. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at terrestrial arthropods as well as moss within the stream channel as well as on the banks of the channel in order to essentially do the bioassessment in a similar way to the aquatic. So for our study, some of our objectives were to characterize these arthropod and biophyte assemblages in dry streams along a gradient of increasing disturbance from oil extraction activities. The particular location of these was in Bakersfield, California, and just kind of all around those oil fields in that area. We also wanted to examine how the stress related to oil production can affect the health of dry streams ecosystems using these assemblages. And lastly, evaluate the ability of these dry stream assessment protocols to detect some sort of ecosystem alteration. So, what kind of stresses are in these oil fields? Well, first of all, oil in the stream, in the channel, in other words, hydrocarbons in the soil. Another thing is just how many oil well pads are within our watershed that we're studying. Third one that we looked at is percent oil field cover, so anything that was deemed as just oil field associated cover, such as the piping, the actual oil well pads themselves, and some of the roads that go through that people use to transport the oil and that sort of thing. All of that is considered the oil field cover. The last two have to do with the sediment actually in the channel, and we use pebble counts for those. So, brief description of some of the images that you see up at the top. The top left one there is, again, some of the piping that is associated with these oil fields. The second one is actually in the stream channel with oil flowing around some of the moss. The second one is the gas that can be found. And the last one is wastewater that comes from the actual oil wells and their drilling and their activities. They just sometimes will just dump the water straight into the stream. So those are some of the stresses that are present in these fields. So for our project, we had 13 sites that we chose non-randomly across a gradient of stress from oil fields. In order to evaluate these sites, it's very similar to SWAMP methods where we took physical habitat measurements, stream characteristics, and site condition. In this case, we would take the previous wetted width of what would normally be a wetted width for the stream. We would take slope measurements. For stream characteristics, we would take things like ortho pool sequences. And for site condition, we would look at natural and other disturbances such as light poles or other paved roads that might be going through that aren't necessarily associated with the oil fields. And in order to collect the oil from the soil, we find the siltiest section of our reach, our sampling reach, and we essentially just took a little core of that piece and we sent it out to SWRCB for them to analyze to get the hydrocarbon data. To actually collect the biota, we had a couple of different ways. We had a 160-meter reach where we had 8 different transects within them, and for arthropods, we sampled them in 2 different ways. The first way was arthropod pitfall sampling. Unfortunately, you can't dig very well, and some of these dry streams are really hard-bottomed. So to compensate for that, we built ramps up to essentially a container with propylene glycol in it, and that sufficed as our pitfall trap. That one was set out the day before sampling, and we came back 24 hours to pick up those samples and put them in jars and keep them. The second way that we monitored for the arthropods was with a vegetation beating bag, which is a really crude way of saying we took a big canvas bag, threw it around some green stuff that was best representative of the channel vegetation. We beat it a couple times with a stick, and we took those contents, put them in a jar with some ethanol, and said, all right, those are the arthropods we found on the vegetation. The third biota, which is the moss sampling, that one was a little bit different. They weren't actually defined transects that we sampled from. Instead, what we did is we looked at the mesohabitats, in other words, the channel and the both left bank and right bank. And we looked through those, and we went through and we flagged each of the different microhabitats that we found moss on. And for each of those mesohabitats, in other words, the channel and the two banks, we spent about 15 minutes sampling from each of those microhabitats, such as, let's say, wood, it could be soil, or even rocks. So we're trying to get a sampling, and our effort was essentially monitored by making sure that we spent 15 minutes on each of the mesohabitats and 2 minutes actually sampling from a specific microhabitat. Of course, once we have all the biota, we had to ID these things. For the arthropods, we had a great group of people that went through and they identified the terrestrial arthropods. We found a lot of things like beetles, some spiders from the vegetation, and also ants were a lot of the dominant arthropods that we found. For the moss identification, a similar tactic was employed for identifying them down to some sort of morphospecies, and these were taken from our dried samples. We put them under a microscope to identify them based on their leaf structure. So after we had all of those items ID'd, we compared them to different metrics, and we had over 200 metrics from the moss and the arthropods combined. For the arthropod metrics, we looked at a variety of combinations of different arthropods. For example, we might look at just beetles, or we might look at beetles and ants combined. But overall, we looked at the different richness, abundance, diversity, evenness, and relative richness and abundance of these organisms. As for the moss, we again looked at different families and genuses of these moss, and we compared them to the richness of the site and diversity and evenness of the sites. For the actual stressors, I'll go ahead and explain how we determined those and calculated those. So again, for the first one, we took that core sample for the oil concentration, sent it off, and we got the hydrocarbon concentration of that soil sample. For the second one, oil well density is just the number of oil pads within the area for the watershed. The third one is percent oil field cover within the watershed, and for the most part, it's just any of that oil field, the piping, the roads, any part that is deemed as the oil field, designated oil field, how much of that covered our entire watershed. And the last two had to do with pebble counts. Again, it's very similar to swamp where you go through and you have the pebble counts and you see what size they are. And so those fine sediments, or the sediment size, was determined by looking at all of those across all of our transects. So since we're looking at a variety of different stressors, we wanted to see how correlated they were with each other, just so we had a better idea of how we can draw conclusions later. One thing to note is that our highest correlation explained about 86% of the variance between our oil concentration in the soil and percent fine sediment. So generally speaking, where we found a lot of oil within the channel, we also found a lot of fine sediment. There's a similar story with the percent of oil field cover area as well as the percent fine sediment. Again, about 77% of the variance is explained for these. And if you kind of glance over the rest of them, they still have some sort of correlation with each other. So they're not completely disconnected, they're very correlated with each other. So, a lot of graphs, but basically what this shows you is our results for our arthropods. And we took each of the 5 stressors and just took the top metric to show you one little sample of one of the metrics for each of those stressors, just to show you the general trends that we're seeing. So if you look at the top left is log oil concentration, and we're comparing that to trap-caught beetles and their abundance relative to the site that they were found. In general, you see this negative trend. So with increasing oil in the stream, we have a decrease in the abundance of the beetles. For the second one, you can see that it's percent oil field cover, and you see, again, a similar trend. This time it's for trap-caught beetles and their richness. So generally speaking, with that increasing stress, you have a decrease in the richness. And this one is actually beetles and ants, just to clarify. So beetles and ants together, their richness is decreasing with an increasing amount of stress. The third one on the top right is oil well density, and very similar trend. It's way more spread out, but a similar trend with increasing oil well density, in other words, more oil pads within our watershed, we see a decrease in trap-caught beetles. And the bottom two are both of those sediment-related ones. You'll notice the left one is decreasing, very similar to what we saw in the past, and that one's percent fine sediment. So with more fine sediment, we see less abundance of our beetles. And the other one, it looks like it's positive, but it's not, just because the median sediment size, if it's really fine sediment, you're gonna find that the more stressed sites are off to the left on that x-axis, and you'll see a decrease in herbivorous beetles in this case. For our moss, we found basically the opposite trend. So instead of being decreasers, for the most part, they're increasers. So again, we have on the top left, we have oil concentration. As the oil concentration is increasing in these sites, we see a general increase in the site Bioassessment richness, which is a family of moss. For percent oil field cover, with increasing percent oil field cover, we see again an increase in the bank Bioassessment richness. And the bank was one of those meso habitats, so just on the banks instead of the entire site. For oil well density, we actually saw kind of a poor relationship as far as linear regression goes, but it did have a slight increasing value. So with the increase in those oil pads, we had an increase in a different family of moss, which is the Bioassessment. At the bottom two, those are sediments. With more fine sediment, there tended to be more of the moss present. And the very last one, the median sediment size, you can actually see there's a kind of a curve. If you ignore the line that's there, there's a little bit of a curve where there's a little spot that the moss like to hang out. And I'll explain a little bit why we think we see that. But in this case, there was a very poor relationship just for a linear regression model. I don't expect you to be able to read or see any of this chart all on the right side. It's just for illustrative purposes. So the red in general means decreasers, meaning with increasing stress, we saw a decrease in our biotic metrics. And the green would be the opposite. So with increasing stress, there was an increase in the biotic metrics. In general, we took out all of our top metrics that had an R-squared greater than 0.3 and looked at those. We saw that there were 30% increasers, which were primarily dominated by moss, with a couple of arthropods like spiders mixed in there. And then we saw that about 70% of those were actually decreasers, and of those, they were dominated by beetles. So in general, most arthropods do tend to be decreasers with increasing oil field stress. We also looked at some of these same methods of sampling in San Diego, but we didn't find as strong of a response to fine sediment. But this might just be due to the different stressors that are present in San Diego, like urbanization and agriculture, that weren't present in Bakersfield, where it was heavily dominated by the oil field stress. One of the mechanisms that we think that might be causing what we saw is that ground-dwelling arthropods, they like to have these interstitial spaces within the stream channel to hide in, to live in, but with oil field disturbance, all the fine sediment that gets kicked up tends to fill in those spaces. So now they no longer have those spaces to inhabit, and we might be seeing a decrease in the richness and abundance of these organisms. Something that we didn't measure directly was the chemical effects. We did measure oil in the soil, but because they're so highly correlated with the fine sediments, it's hard to parse it out without more maybe toxicological data. But this could also be associated with the decrease that we saw in the beetles. In general, the mosses are increasers, and we think part of the reason that they're increasers is because bryophytes like disturbance when it adds nutrients and water into the soil. These areas are highly ephemeral and naturally, but when you add all the wastewater from the oil rigs and the processes that are happening there, you're adding nutrients and water they normally wouldn't have. Also, oil can tend to stabilize some of those fine sediments, and the moss really like those nice stable soils. So just to really quickly zoom in on one active spill site, so we can see how we can maybe apply some of these things for maybe some sort of damage function in the future. This is the buried petrospill site. It had low richness and abundance for the top arthropod metrics, and somewhere in the middle for richness for top bryophyte metrics. But we noticed it had really high fine sediment and pretty low oil concentration. We think this might be due to some of the oil removal processes that they have to do if there is an oil spill. And it also tends to kick up that fine sediment, which is why we think we might have seen low richness for the beetles and maybe a low concentration for the oil. So again, really quick, beetles are a really promising metric for this type of oil impacted system. Other arthropods and bryophytes can be used with a little bit further studying. And some of the ways that we can improve this type of study is using a larger data set, adding the toxicological data so that we can see if there's any sort of effect from those, looking at moss for toxin absorption, or even getting more active oil spill information. So kind of tying in Karen's talk and Dan's talk together, we can use this sort of BMI assessment in order to inform some MMIs or some ODEs in order to create the same evaluation system that we have for, let's say, swamp or for the CSCI. And terrestrial arthropods and bryophytes can be used for that. We're currently developing some multimetric indices and the ODEs that can bring us closer to getting a damage function that could potentially assess something like that big Chevron land oil spill. There was no way to really say, okay, this is how much damage was caused, and this might help fill in those gaps as soon as we can get a robust enough multimetric index or ODE. And of course, we can use this information and we can compare things to like Dan's study where he looked at CRAM. Comparing those multimetric indices or the ODEs to the CRAM and seeing how they're related can further us in this quest to assessing dry streams. And of course, I'd like to thank the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the EPA, the Watershed Institute, and SWRCB, as well as all the hardworking members of our lab that put this together and did all the hard work.
Hi, thanks for the nice talk. What are some of the mechanisms that you think are at play with increased bryophytes in areas with higher oil impacts and higher fine sediment?
Can you repeat the second half of your question?
Just why do you think you're finding more moss in areas with more impacts from oil and higher fine sediment? Do they like to grow in fine sediment? Is that part of?
So I think I mentioned it earlier in one of the slides. We think that the added nutrients into the system from the wastewater that comes off of these oil fields, they like that stuff. And moss are pretty fast growing and they like to have that disturbance. But at the same time, the oil actually in the soil, some of the channels that we've been in had layers of just oil dirt clods. And the moss would actually grow right on top of that. That one picture that I showed you where the oil is just flowing around the moss, they actually like that area. So we think that's probably why we're seeing an increase in those areas.
One of the first things you showed us was a correlation between the different stressors. And you pointed out the high correlation between the fine sediments and the concentrations of hydrocarbons. Mm-hmm. Was there any attempt to normalize it to % fines? That is, to actually look at how much hydrocarbons you have for only the fine sediments?
No, we did not. And I think part of the reason is because we only sampled in one location at each stream for those hydrocarbons.
And what was the % fines in each sample for hydrocarbons? Did you have a high variety of % fines?
For the most part, these streams were dominated by fine sediment. But I couldn't answer that exact question because I don't remember.
Thank you. It might be good to look at it because we know that hydrocarbons will be found at very high concentrations in fine sediments, but very little in larger particles. Thank you.
Well, again, since we're out of time, the last slides you showed was, maybe thinking that you could get MMI or over E for these non-perennial streams. How close are you to, I mean, do you know how, is it real? I mean, do you think it'll happen?
Yeah, so we actually do have some MMIs that Ralphael has worked on, as well as one of the other grad students at CSU Monterey Bay. They worked on it for mostly just San Diego, right? And so they've created it for that one, but we haven't applied it to Bakersfield because it's such a different set of stressors. As far as the O to E, we actually have a graduate student that's working on that right now as his thesis project and creating those O to Es for these particular dry stream sites.
So then how many sites do you have throughout California that, reference, what they call reference sites? How many are there for this?
Off the top of my head, I want to say it's about 50 statewide. We are working on a project for the EPA that includes Arizona. So we have reference sites in that state as well. And we should have a draft MMI for that full region early next year. So we do have a San Diego MMI out now that it's on a SWRCB report you can download if you want to check it out. I'll send you a copy.
Is 50 enough?
It's what we have. But I would definitely encourage you to talk to Andrew during the, Andrew, you have a poster on developing an O to E? No, you don't? Oh, well, then just chat with Andrew over the drinks later and ask him about building an O to E.
Hi, thank you. Good presentation. I had a question just for curiosity of the composition of the wastewater. Is it from the facilities like sewage and gray water, or is it from the actual oil extraction activities?
I can't answer that question because I was just there to observe that picture that I had. I just took it really quick and it was just in the stream. All it said on it was wastewater. So who knows where that was from?
Yeah, it's mostly it's produced water during the oil extraction. So it's not sewage. It's got tons of hydrocarbons and metals and radioactive stuff in there too.
Is it going to treatment? Can you repeat that? Is it going to a treatment? We don't know. Okay. Good. Or not good.
Hi, good talk. Did you observe any invertebrates, macroinvertebrates on the moss samples?
Unfortunately, no. The only thing that we might have found is maybe an exoskeleton of some sort from an insect, but for the most part, we didn't record those.
Hey, nice talk. Curious about the invertebrate or the arthropod methods. Did you try to break out the metrics for the pitfall samples and the vegetation samples? And if you did you see differences in their responsiveness?
Yeah, so we had everything separated by the method that they were caught by, and then of those metrics, we did see in general the trap-caught organisms tended to score better as far as looking at the individual stressors than the vegetation, but some of the vegetation things still did reach over that 0.3 R-squared threshold.
That's sort of what I was guessing, but okay, thanks.
So, Pete, just an interesting point of view. That's the exact opposite of what we saw in San Diego, where the vegetation metrics were really great indicators of stress compared to the trap metrics. So there's a lot of complicated stuff going on that we're trying to figure out still.
Hello, I have a question. This is a really great presentation, by the way. I was just curious about what communication looked like, if at all, with the companies that had where this was happening, and also if there was any communication in terms of data when you were collecting your sites, or when you were also considering, was there any dredging or any other activities that were conducted nearby? Yeah. So I'm just curious what the communication looked like.
So I wasn't there for the beginning of the project when they set it all up, but I do know that this active spill information that we got was very limited. They're kind of guarded in that way where they don't like to give us a lot of the information as soon as it happens. We'd rather kind of cover it up and clean it up.
overall, where was the historic drainage basins for the particular area? You say it's located in, near Bakersfield. Were you on the west side or the east side of the valley?
It was actually on both sides. Most of our sites were on the west side of that valley, and then we had about 3 or 4 sites that were on the east side, but none that were directly like in the city.
Okay, because I was just wondering, you know, the overall drainage basin, how that could have some effect because of the west sides, there's some really nasty stuff over there.
Yeah, and because we didn't randomly select for those things, we don't have an idea, or we couldn't say what the difference is, but hopefully moving forward, we can get a variety of sites in those areas and start to compare those effects.
Hi. Do you think adding coarse sediment to oil-impacted sites could test if the oil or the sediment is driving the decreases in arthropods?
Right, can you repeat the first part of your question?
Yeah, I was wondering if you were to add coarse sediment to the high oil impact, high fine sediment sites, if you could see if the sediment could improve the sites or if the oil has effects over time there regardless of the sediment size.
Yeah, that would actually be really interesting to look at to see if we could modify these streams and see how that would affect some of the oil absorption or just any of the impacts, or let's see if we could add those coarser sediments or stones and see if the beetles like that a little bit better. That would be a cool experiment to do.
Did you do any kind of distance away from the stream testing for arthropods? Since they're not restricted to a stream channel, I mean, do you see a decrease in the channel versus, say, 20 feet away from the stream channel?
So for this particular study, we did not sample outside of the channel because the assemblages that are present, we know that they're separate from the riparian area versus actually in the channel. The channel has a little bit more unique arthropods. What those are exactly, we haven't looked at those yet, as far as I know.
Are there currently any plans to include dry stream bioassessment in the California regulatory? It seems like there's science developing.
I mean, it's definitely going in that direction, but maybe Rocky can speak more to that.
Well, I think for this project in particular, there is a desire to have tools to calculate natural resource damages. That's why the Department of Fish and Wildlife is really interested in this. So it may get used now. Right now, like that giant oil spill that she mentioned in Kern County, there was no natural resource damages that they assessed, as far as I know. I think there were some fees, but they weren't about natural resources damages. It's an ephemeral stream, nothing's damaged, right? I can't really speak for the water boards and what they're using. I don't know. Some of this work was funded by San Diego. I don't know if Chad would want to comment on what his agency is thinking about that now. Or... No?
I guess my question would be also related to the previous question. Say the new definition of waters of the U.S. It's not the topic we want to get into it, but including you and previous presenters as well, how the approach that we have in the California, where more than half of them would be either the intermittent or ephemeral, and then the efforts that we do would be actually being affected by the new definition, and then moving forward, how that change in terms of our using this data of scientific studies to policy changes and other things. Just asking your opinion on you and everybody else as well.
Well, hopefully this isn't for no reason, right? But I do hope that this stuff does get integrated and we do see the value. And part of this is to say, hey, there is a value for these ephemeral and intermittent streams. They're not just wastelands that you can dump whatever you want into and it won't affect anything. So hopefully it does eventually get integrated into the system. How fast, that depends on funding. But hopefully we do reach that point where we are using this stuff, and it's a standard way of assessing them. And we do begin to see the importance nationwide.
So, I mean, one of the reasons why we had the talk from Dan and Karen earlier is to show, regardless of the regulatory framework, regardless of whether there's changes to the federal waters of the U.S. or waters of the state, you can't really manage a watershed if you're just focusing on like 5% of that watershed. So you really still need these tools, and that's a management need, not a regulatory need necessarily.